I always planned on murdering my wife, but somebody beat me to the strangle. Brittany had been a real firecracker of a gal, spunky. We met in college, where she was a forward on the women's soccer team. The fire she showed on the pitch, dribbling past lesser opponents, unafraid to run over them. The way she used her body like both a blunt instrument and a surgeon's knife. Well, the first time I saw Brittany play, I knew I had to have her. I needed to dominate that incredible female power and strength, consume it. But did I ever really get to do so? And did she ever get to see the real me? Even after we married, after we had a daughter together? No, she didn't. If I had gotten to murder her, like I always planned, then she would have. In those last few moments, as the life left her eyes, I would get to look into them and know that they finally understood me. But that opportunity was stolen from me forever. Brittany was found dead last week, strangled in the alley behind her office. Funnily enough, that was the exact way I always fantasized about killing her. In our bed, though not in a dirty alley. I had played the scenario out thousands of times in my head. I would stare at her until she asked me something like,
"What is it?"
Then I would say,
"Me,"
and wrap my fingers around her neck. And then I would squeeze and squeeze, and she would fight and fight, but it would be no use. All that raw, athletic power in her tight little body would be nothing against a man like myself. And then she'd be gone. And then I'd put a bullet in my brain. But that fantasy never got to become reality, because some selfish asshole, a stranger, killed her. Murder your own wife, dickhead. In my life, whenever times were tough, all that kept me going was knowing that at least I had that big finale to look forward to. And that man stole it from me. I was going to kill myself tonight, after the funeral. There was no point in going on without my big finale to look forward to anymore. As we were driving home, I caught a glimpse of my daughter in the rearview mirror. It was the first time I ever noticed how much she was starting to look like my wife. I thought. She was only a freshman, but she was already starting in varsity soccer as well. She had that same firecracker spirit as her mother on the pitch. I thought again. Maybe I won't kill myself just yet. Sure, my big finale was now impossible, at least as originally intended. That ship had sailed with my wife's murder. But as I looked at her spitting image in the rearview mirror, I couldn't help but think of that old adage. Whenever one door closes, another opens. I have a tattoo of a swastika on my chest. A big one, like Ed Norton's in American History X. I was so proud the day the ink set, not proud like white pride, but proud to be a part of something bigger than myself. I was 16 when I got it, but my dad called it a birthmark, the heraldry of pure Aryan blood, of family. When I was 4 or so, my mom was killed in a home invasion. She was beaten and left as a crumpled, half-naked, bloody mess on the living room floor. My dad took Polaroids of her body when he found her. You know who did this? Remember Dylan? It wasn't a man. It was an animal, a vermin. This is their nature. Yours is to exterminate. Those photos heartened me. My dad's words stuck with me. He was absolutely right. I grew up smart, cunning. My hate simmered rather than boiling over in a flurry of sea keels and hasty violence. My mother's photos taught me that a slow bleed kills just as effectively as a severed artery. Melanie can't see my tattoos. She doesn't know. I can see one of hers, Nefertiti, behind her left ear. I met her at a community action meeting hosted by Deshaun Brooks, a black mayoral candidate. We talked. I charmed. She laughed. We had coffee after and she told me she was mixed. My dad would have called her white mother a race traitor. 3 months and 4 meetings later, and we're in my car, driving.
Babe, where are we going?
Babe, I'll remember that when the blood begins to flow, I thought to myself. Just stay here. I'll be right back. A few minutes later, and I walk back to my car. My fists are bruised and my shirt is bloody. She sees it immediately. I see fear.
Babe, what?
I sigh, a knot in my stomach untightening. I made this city safer. Deshaun Brooks had said that he wanted change. My dad, on the other hand, was steadfast. He was violent. He beat me as a kid, and he beat his girlfriends. But Kylie and Jessica had been victims of burglaries, just like my mom. Their death seeded hate, and I tended the bloody crop. Until I met Melanie. She showed me my dad's vermin, and I saw people. And she taught me things. Things like, the vast majority of white women are killed by white men. Men like my dad. And the vast majority of white men are killed by white men too. Men like me. As my dad gurgled blood, I told him about Melanie, and he called me a race traitor. Better that than a traitor to the human race. In spite of his rhetoric, he never made me into an exterminator, but with his violent hands, he sculpted his executioner. Melanie didn't stay with me after she saw what I did and what I was, but her words and her love did. Now I hate a little less. Jennifer has a boyfriend problem, and this is her story. I started dating my current boyfriend, Mark, about a year ago. We literally bumped into each other in a bar, and I ended up getting my drink spilled all over me. He was so apologetic and immediately bought me a drink to replace the one that spilled. We ended up chatting away for the rest of the night and got on like a house on fire. We went on a few dates, and he asked me to be his girlfriend on the 3rd date. I have never had a more caring or loving boyfriend than Mark. He can always tell when I am upset, and will do anything he can to cheer me up. I know he is a bit old-fashioned, but I don't care as I love him. I only have one issue with Mark, which is that he wears the most outdated and just tacky-looking jewelry. I don't mind men wearing jewelry, but honestly I feel so embarrassed when he wears it out in public. He explained to me that the jewelry has been handed down for generations through his family, and it is a tradition to wear it. Our 1-year anniversary was approaching, so I decided to use this as a perfect excuse to get rid of the jewelry. I went out and bought him some really fashionable stuff that I loved, and threw all of his old tacky stuff in a dumpster. I knew he would be annoyed with me, but didn't care. He was very stressed when he arrived home on the day of our anniversary, as he got out of work much later than intended. He began to panic when he wasn't able to find the jewelry and began ripping the drawers in a vain attempt to find it. I brought out his present, and I could see the horror on his face when I explained that I had thrown out his old tacky stuff. He demanded that I leave, but I refused as this was my house too. I was extremely confused, when he told me that I would have to face the consequences of my actions. Later that evening, he offered to bring me for a late night walk, and I happily agreed. He was very quiet and barely acknowledged that I was there. We eventually reached a hill that had a nice view of the stars. He smiled at me, and I smiled back, thinking our fight had been resolved. I couldn't help but notice how hairy his chin had gotten as the moonlight lit up his face. I took a couple of steps back as he collapsed to the ground screaming. My body was frozen in place as I watched his body become more muscular and hairier. His clothes ripped off him and lay forgotten on the ground. It was only as he raised his head and howled at the moon that I finally understood why he wore so much silver jewelry. I would do anything to stay alive. Anything. Dying scares me. I think it scares all of us. The great unknown, the last great mystery. Some people believe it's just a stepping off point, an end to suffering that takes you someplace better. I just see it as an end. The idea of losing myself, fading away. It scares me. I'd do anything to avoid it. Anything to stay alive. Anything. When the doctor told me I had 6 months left, I could not accept that. I pursued every avenue, every treatment, but the clock kept ticking down. Every day, I got a little weaker. Every day, I died a little more as the cancer took more from me. I watched my wife, my beloved Chanel, give me up. Oh yes, she stayed by my side, but I saw it in her eyes. The resignation, grief. I despised it. I would do anything to stay alive. Anything. The world is full of mystery if you know where to look. It started with desperation, a search for a new cure. Some diamond in the rough that would save me. I suppose I found it. Some called them gods. Others called them old fae or dryads. Ancient things in the woods. Magical things that offered gifts in exchange for items of true value. The forums I read sounded like a joke at first. I wasn't going to pay it much mind. These people seemed insane, despite their conviction to their mad beliefs. But the pictures, the detailed descriptions of their rituals. It was too elaborate to be complete bullshit, wasn't it? My strength was fading. If I was going to do it, I needed to do it soon. I went out alone. The forest was a few hours away, but I made it all the same. Chanel humored me. I knew she would. She thought I was going to die. But that was fine. It worked in my favor. The trail of mushrooms leading into the woods was long and winding, but well-traveled. This one was one of the weaker ones, so its trial was not that difficult. Follow the path until the sunlight faded. As we went deeper, the mushrooms started to glow. Chanel wanted to turn back. I told her no. I made her keep going. I refused to stop until we found it, and in time we did. It was great and horrible as it greeted us on the path, surveying us as it awaited my offering. Chanel never saw it coming. She thought I was weak. But you don't need much strength to slide a knife across someone's throat. I said I'd do anything to stay alive. Anything. I made my wish. I received my gift. I won't die, but the cancer is still there. And every day the pain gets worse and worse. The suffering gets worse. And now it will never end. warm and snug, she lies in her bed, hoping with all her might sleep will just take over. Eyes squeezed shut, trying not to think. All is quiet. She relaxes a little, yawns and snuggles into her bed. She feels herself starting to drift and sighs. A soft scratching noise drifts up, the very sound she didn't want to hear. She curls up tight, trying to ignore the sound, the fear building in her stomach. The scratching stops and she knows why. The floor seems to have a ripple, then slowly one claw appears, sharp, long and dirty. 3 more follow, then the hand. The skin is white, the veins black, crisscrossing under the skin. The head slowly appears, black eyes, rimmed with red, 2 holes for a nose, a mouth too small for the teeth. It drips saliva. The smell of rotten meat fills her nose. The monster pulls himself out, a contorted smile on its face. Its body is skinny and covered in scars. There is a new cut across its leg, still seeping black blood. She is petrified, and she can't move. This thing started coming 2 weeks ago, but no one believes her, and she can't scream. Her throat feels tight, as if it is closing over. She starts silently crying. She has been able to hold her cry every other night, to show it she is not scared, but tonight she can't. She lets the tears flow. The thing in front of her is hideous. She wants to look away, but she can't. She wants to run, but she is as frozen. She wants to do anything other than sit here in fear. The thing looks at her with a strange expression, slowly moves its hand. With a claw it grabs a tissue from her bedside table and hands it to her. She is confused, but takes the tissue. The thing sits down on the floor, completely still. When it looks up, its eyes have changed to a green color, a distinctive green. She knows this color. Her best friend had the same green in his eyes. He went missing 3 months ago. Suddenly, she understands the curse, the old wives' tale, that once every 10 years, a boy is given and turned into a monster. And unless he is recognized, he will stay like that forever. Before she overthinks it all, she utters his name.
Oin, is that you?
The thing screams. Its body is thrashing, moving too fast for her eyes to follow. The thrashing starts to slow down, and Oin is lying there on the floor soaked in sweat. She gently touches his shoulder. He screams, then opens his eyes. He blinks at her. He raises his hands to his face. He seems to be in shock.
Oin, it's me, Trinity. Can you hear me?
Oin nods his head. Trinity helps him onto the bed. He curls up. She wraps her arms around him. She closes her eyes. She doesn't notice the sharp claws coming back, nor remember there is no curse, just a thought, planted in an innocent mind. The heat from the fireplace did nothing to shake the chill from the storm raging outside. We were called to the sitting room for the evening and poured a crystal glass of the finest drink money could buy in our small town.
Oh my, this is splendid,
the plump man beside me exclaimed, waving the wine glass around carelessly.
Simply splendid. Wherever did you get it?
His eyes were wide and maniacal, and his mustache twitched with glee. I leaned away from him in an unfettered attempt to distance myself before the glass's contents ended up on my lap.
You'll never guess,
answered the white-haired woman in the fox fur, perched daintily in a leather lounge chair to my left.
The marketplace on the corner of Main and First has quite a tasty selection, if I do say so myself.
The corner of her lip curled up into a partial smirk. The large man let out a hearty laugh.
How? I may just have to make a stop on my way home tonight. Maybe for some dessert.
The atmosphere was light-hearted, with a touch of something unholy. But no outsider would even notice until it was too late, of course. Another gentleman, seated to the right, spoke up in a soft but rather assertive voice.
You haven't touched your glass,
he noted, nodding in my direction. Indeed, I hadn't. There it sat, unwanted, on the table in front of me. I met his eyes, dark as coal and cold as ice. I'm not much of a drinker these days, I replied. My father got into some trouble with the law not too long ago due to his drinking problem.
Hold out as long as you can,
chimed a young woman from the doorway.
but eventually we all give in.
The small crowd chortled and clinked glasses. I smiled lightly, not understanding how any aspect of this lifestyle was amusing. I turned back to face my glass, staring at the firelight dancing on the liquid surface. I could feel the saliva pulling in my mouth, but was instantly filled with disgust. Just then, the doorbell rang, sending loud, echoing waves of bells throughout the large house.
I'll get it,
Piped the young woman. Her heels click-clacked on the tile, and within moments, she had returned with a disheveled-looking man in tow. I stiffened when I saw him. He was soaking wet from the rain, and his entire right side was bloodied.
This poor young man fell off his horse.
She closed the door to the room, locking it in the process, and helped him into the chair next to me. The room was dead silent, all eyes on the young man. My vision began to blur. I tried to shake the feeling, but I couldn't stop my fangs from poking through my gums. He looked at me, realization and fear rapidly spreading across his face. I'm sorry, I hissed, letting my primal instincts take over, but you never stood a chance. I loved her eyes, but now she was staring at me again. I hated when she did that. I rolled over in bed to face the wall. I couldn't stand that piercing gaze. When we had first met, all I could think about were her eyes. She had the most beautiful, sky blue eyes you could ever imagine. But as time went on, her eyes became cold and judgmental, as if the reason she was where she was entirely my fault. Though, I suppose I had some part to play. She had been over to my place several times a week for months. We had met in our physics class, the both of us working towards our engineering degrees, and we instantly hit it off. I knew the moment she walked into the room, she was the one for me. I figured that, if I had offered to study with her, eventually I could get her to come over. And it worked. At first, she was unsure naturally, as going to a stranger's house can be a little unnerving. But she soon realized I was no threat to her, and eventually she was spending nights at mine. It wasn't until a few weeks ago that I remembered why I had wanted her so badly. We were enjoying a bottle of wine together when I noticed her eyes had changed color. They had gone from a sky blue to an almost electric blue. When I asked her about it, she told me they occasionally changed color depending on the weather. Brilliant, right? Not so much. See, fast forward a few weeks, and her eyes had become a stormy gray. Not nearly as exciting as the bright blue I had fallen in love with. I rolled back over. Her eyes were still staring at me. What is your problem? I demanded. Nothing but silence. I groaned and got up, stumbling to the other side of the room. I couldn't do this anymore. I reached for the jar and turned it around so they faced away from me. Maybe I should have kept a different souvenir. His teeth were far too long, not sharp, just long. I only saw them when he ordered. He would walk into the coffee shop and linger at the door for a long moment, quietly staring forward and always completely still. He wouldn't shift or fidget at all, and for minutes sometimes. I would glance at his rather pronounced Adam's apple as it sat stationary in his throat. What kind of person doesn't swallow? Anyway, whenever he saw that the queue of customers had gone, he would lurch forward, almost as though he were beginning a sprint, only to stop just shy of the register. And then he would remove his mask and wait for me to speak. "Welcome to the grind service. What can I get you?" His stare was piercing, unfaltering, and his irises and pupils blended together in a uniform blackness.
One small black coffee to go. And would you mind grinding these?
He always calmly said that exact phrase, handing me a bag of beans from our retail area. And he always followed it with 3 slow clicks of his teeth. It was unsettling, but he was a paying customer, so I didn't have much room to refuse him service. I just didn't know why he always ordered from me. It was 2 months or so into his very regular appearances that I started to have trouble sleeping. I would lie in bed thinking about his burrowing stare and his teeth, while trying to focus on the cool hum of the window unit near my bed. Eventually, I would always drift to sleep, but then I would awake nearly as tired as I had been the night before. I was griping to a coworker about it over my very necessary 3rd espresso of the morning, when she suggested, "Maybe you're tossing and turning in your sleep too much. Could be a bunk mattress, or wild guess here, man. The caffeine? Frack." Maybe she was right. Maybe the guy with the teeth was getting to me, or maybe my obsession was a symptom of over-caffeination. I set up a webcam in my room that night to test my coworker's theory. If I tossed and turned, I'd try to cut down on the caffeine. If not, I'd confront the teeth guy, tell him to be less weird or something. Easy enough, right? The next morning, I awoke tired as ever, so I opened my laptop and checked on my sleep. Me on my cell phone. Me reading. Cell phone again. And then on the podcast. By 1:25 a.m., I seemed to be asleep. I watched at triple speed as I lay mostly still until around 3 a.m., when something caught my attention. I paused and backtracked. The stillness of the night vision feed was grating as I waited for the movement I knew I had seen. And then at 3:10 a.m., I began to sweat as I watched my AC unit slide slowly backward out of the window, replaced by a familiar toothy face. Now, I live on the 3rd floor. There's no ledge or fire escape out of that window, just open air and a 30-foot drop. It made no sense, but even as my mind processed a seemingly impossible sight, I watched and listened intently. The man from the coffee shop leaned his head inward and calmly said,
One small black coffee to go. And would you mind grinding these?
I then watched his narrow hand extend a small bag through the open window. Click, click, click. I heard his teeth, and then I reached over and grabbed the bag from him. I sat in stunned astonishment as I watched myself stand up from my bed and wander off. Moments later, I heard a distant, high-pitched sound. What the hell was it? His face hovered in the darkness of my window frame for the next minute or so until finally, I came back with the bag. As the me of that video handed it to him, I finally realized what the sound had been. My coffee grinder. I paused the video and ran to the kitchen. The grinder was empty, clean, but as I searched for clues of what I had ground, something small caught my eye at the corner of the floor and the base of the cabinet. A few shards of what I first thought was white pottery and a tooth. Not a long one like his, but a regular molar with roots and a dark silver filling. I tried to convince myself that I had found something ordinary, perhaps a tooth that had simply fallen out. I tried to overlook the porous fragments that accompanied it. I wanted the contents of that bag to have been bizarre, but not sinister. I wanted that, but then I returned to my room and watched the rest of the video. Those last few minutes disturbed me in a way that will intrude upon my sleep, no matter what may happen tonight. After I handed him his bag of ground bones, I just sort of stood there in front of the man in the window as he silently regarded me. Then after a long pause, he asked me my height and weight, and I answered him. He looked me up and down and smiled broadly, and with a final click of his teeth, he replied,
7 bags ought to do.
Mandy was a bright student, top of her class. Other kids bullied her and made her life miserable, but she always had me to talk to. I saw what nobody else saw, a kind and caring person. She was different, a fact that made her a target for the whole school. To me, she was just Mandy, but to everyone else, she was Maggot Mandy, due to the strange pets that squirmed around inside the infected wounds, covering her arms and legs. Being an outcast myself, I know how it feels to be so isolated from everyone else, so I decided to talk to her one day. And that was the day I met my best friend. Once I eventually gained her trust, she introduced me to her little pets. Douglas was the shy one. He would sometimes pop out from the pus-filled wound on her forearm, but he didn't much like strangers. Greg was the outgoing one. He would tunnel out from her flesh and crawl into her hand. He was my favorite. Such a friendly little guy. And then there was Sherm the worm, who had taken up residence in her leg. Greg didn't like Sherm that much. Mandy reckoned it was jealousy. There were many other little critters living both in and on her body. They were her family. Mandy's mother was a prostitute, and her father was killed by a rival drug dealer. So her home life wasn't good. But as she always said, her pets were her reason for living. But as we got older, I grew more concerned about her. Her once pretty face was covered in infected wounds, and even more maggots were living there rent-free. She had become blind in one of her eyes, due to all her pets eating it away, and she had grown skinny from the tapeworms she had purposefully ate. She didn't mind though. To her, she was merely nourishing her little ones. Teachers also became concerned, so they called social services, who promptly removed Mandy from her toxic home. She was never the same after that, as doctors cleaned her entire body and rid her of the maggots and worms living inside her flesh. Mandy became depressed after losing her babies. She grew quiet and ignored all my attempts at talking to her. Until one day, she didn't turn up for school. I went over to her foster family's house, and they told me she had run away and the police were looking for her. 5 days later, her body was found in a field, absolutely crawling with maggots. She had sliced her body to pieces and covered herself in honey. Mandy died as she lived. nourishing her babies. A heart attack, they'd said. A bad one. I'd legally died for 3 minutes and 44 seconds. I was 42 years old. I didn't realize what was happening. I just thought I was dreaming. I was in a bookstore. It was an old bookstore, but it was surprisingly bright. I wandered around in a lonely daze for a while, unsure of how long. In this place, time isn't a thing. It doesn't exist. It cannot be counted, seen, or felt in any way. It was only when I picked up a book that I realized I wasn't dreaming. First word, that was the title, and a picture of myself as a baby. I slowly opened the book with intrigue and slight confusion. Suddenly, I was sucked into the book, and ultimately reliving the moments just before, during, and just after my first word, which was no. The book sucked and spun me back out into the bookstore. I replaced the book and continued to walk through the store, up and down every aisle, scanning the spines of the books while running my fingertips across them and quickly absorbing their titles. First steps, first kiss, losing my virginity, first driving lesson. The books continued in no particular order. My only guess would be because time is non-existent here, and it wouldn't really matter what part of my lifeline went where. I jumped in and out of my memories, one after the other. It was incredible. I could relive any part of my life with zero consequence. I would just be sucked back to here, free to enjoy another part of the bookstore. I could go back and see old family members again and bask in their loving presence. I could do this forever. Thump. I go flying across the room. Something just punched me directly in my chest. I felt no pain though, and I get back up. Thump. I'm knocked backwards once more. This time, my entire body penetrated through the walls, and I'm propelled back into my now worthless and half-dead body. The next few days were apparently touch and go, but I don't remember a thing. All I could think about was the bookstore. I was discharged from the hospital a week later, and as I returned home to my empty apartment and sad little life, I instantly shook my head, and I knew exactly what to do. A bottle of whiskey and a tub of pills later, I died once again. It was dark, utterly and completely dark. I felt around. Nothing. No sounds, no light, no memories, nothing. I sat in a slump against one of the walls and cried.
"Oh, why are you crying, child?"
said an old and creepy voice from nowhere or everywhere.
This is what you have chosen, child. This is what happens when you cheat."
And with that, a solid sheet of metal attached itself to my face. It fit perfectly. All I could do was sit and listen to the mysterious and horrendous voice laugh into eternity.
The resonance is really quite beautiful once you learn to play,
my Uncle Ambrose said, gently stroking a thin curve of glass. I beamed back, not in appreciation for the art instrument or at him, but rather at what he represented. He was eccentricity, curiosity, and capability. A wizard lacking magic, but possessed of all the other qualities I imagined of a medieval arcanist.
a glass armonica, one of Franklin's greatest inventions,
he remarked, almost to himself. If you've ever run a wet finger around the edge of a glass and heard a note, Imagine dozens of those glasses, nested together, and turning around a central spindle, and you might get the idea. I had heard him play once for my aunt before she passed. He looked at it wistfully, moving his fingers in a silent phantom melody.
I play for my Sophia every time she...
He stopped, a forlorn look creeping across his face.
Your aunt had a trying life. The music cheered her up.
I knew what he alluded to. My mother had told me that my aunt had had a number of pregnancies that ended tragically. Sophia had doted on us nephews and nieces, but always with a reserved sadness. My uncle was so affected by his hapless role in attempted fatherhood that even years later, he would weep over the newspaper whenever a child went missing. "What are you playing?" I asked as his fingers meandered above the glass.
It's called Cormac,
he said, staring off.
a song I hope to never finish writing.
The day passed into evening with the addition of my friend Marcel, and as we played with brass sextants and planned routes through old terra incognito maps of Africa, my uncle continued his silent compositions. After dinner, Marcel and I turned in for the night, and as we chatted about the oddities to uncover tomorrow, I could almost hear my uncle's song, an echo in the ether. And then I did hear it. The ghostly tones awoke me sometime after midnight, and after seeing Marcel's bundled silhouette in bed, I stole out of our guest room alone. The music was haunting, drifting through the night air, and as I began to quietly descend the stairs, I heard a somehow familiar voice.
So lovely, Ambrose. What do you call it?
It was a woman's voice. My uncle answered, his voice trembling melancholically.
I just call it Marcel.
As I peered into the living room through the spindles on the stairs, I saw my uncle at the glass armonica, beside a pair of outstretched legs on the ground. He leaned down and brought back his hand, fingertips glistening with blood. The next morning, he told me that Marcel had awoken in the night, scared. He had driven him home.
He seemed embarrassed. Cormac, so best not to tell.
Uncle, what happened to Aunt Sophia's babies after they died? He looked surprised for a moment, saying nothing, but his fingers reflexively played a few phantom bars that told me everything. The way they found her that morning isn't the worst part of this story. The body lay face down in the dirt, her arms resting unnaturally on the steps, reaching for the front door. She had almost made it. A trail left in the dirt behind the body indicated that she had dragged herself here from the place where they'd left her. What little of her clothes remained were tattered and torn, barely clinging to her lifeless body, and doing near to nothing to preserve her modesty. The blood and dirt clumped in her hair were still wet. She must have been yet alive not more than an hour ago. "Get up," said the pastor. "It's time to go." Realizing that the girl was dead, he sighed. What a shame. She was one of my favorites. Perhaps he could hear the callousness in his own words, or he noticed the shock and anger in her father's eyes upon hearing them. Either way, he was encouraged to speak further. "We must act," he said. "You too," speaking to the young men who accompanied him. "Wrap her up in a blanket and put her in my car." Her father began to protest. You can't. Now, the pastor interrupted. "It is God's will that she be taken to the parsonage. God wishes that I send a message to the other churches to let them know what has happened." On the south side, stands a large church, the primary campus of 12 throughout the city. The receptionist, an unapologetic middle-aged woman, was the first to receive their package from the pastor. The plain box was sitting just inside the foyer doors. The package was medium-sized and slightly heavier than it seemed it should be. It left behind a sanguine stain on the tile as she lifted it, the contents rolling around, unbalanced inside. The pastor had worked diligently through the night, preparing his packages and his message. With each passing of saw blade through bone, he thought carefully about how he would construct his message. Certainly, he couldn't let anyone know that it was him the men wanted, that he tossed out the woman to take his place. No, that wouldn't do. What if the word got out that this woman had been his captive to do with as he pleased? Unacceptable, of course. He worked as a master carpenter, sawing with precision. He first removed the legs at the knee and then at the hip. He then proceeded to the arms, again, in 2 pieces each. The head was simple, compensating for the great difficulty he experienced, separating her torso into 3 equal segments. In the end, he decided the belly should go to the north side campus, and each breast segment to each of the local campus crusades chapters. 12 pieces was shipped out, with the following message: Brothers and sisters in Christ, look at what the godless men from the inner city have done to this helpless, innocent child of God. Unite with me against these savages. The will of God is on our side. Signed, Pastor Levi. He held the revolver like a chrome-plated threat, gesturing with it as he spoke. We knew the game, but the gun wasn't part of it, unless you played it wrong. Felix pointed to me, and I looked down the barrel into ominous dark.
Truth or dare?
His eyes stared vacantly, but his lips goaded with a slight smirk. We hated the game, and he knew it, but we played anyway. His house, his rules. We lived in his father's town. He knew that we knew what that meant. Truth, I said. You always chose truth when Felix was asking. We knew what his dare would be, a test of luck as he called it. But I knew it was just his sadistic way of toying with us. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of watching me flinch.
Too bad.
A skeletal smirk remained as he spoke.
So, if you had to kill Kelsey, how would you do it?
Kelsey, my girlfriend, sat beside me, and she squeezed my hand as his dull eyes watched, unblinking. I'd do it quickly, painlessly. His smirk curled into a grin as his grip tightened on the gun.
I don't know if you can die painlessly. Even with a bullet through the brain, there's still gotta be something, right?
His smile dropped.
No one's lucky enough to die well.
I glared at him as his expression returned nothing. I wanted to leave, but leaving would mean that my dad would work doubles at the factory for a month. There was one thing I wanted more: for the game to end for good. Felix, truth or dare? I asked.
I will of course take dare.
Then kill yourself, I asked. His smirk returned.
I'll give it my best shot.
He released the revolver's cylinder, spun it, and flicked it shut before bringing the muzzle to his temple. A test of luck, Russian roulette. Felix made a big show of his luck, and in this game, I had seen him spin and pull the trigger dozens, maybe hundreds, of times. No one's that lucky. He pulled the trigger. Click. Same as always. No flinch. The luck of a cheat. He turned to Kelsey.
Truth or dare?
Kelsey squeezed my hand tightly. Too tightly. I turned to face her and saw the hatred simmering in her eyes. She was clearly up to something.
If I choose dare, we don't play this fracking game again? And no consequences for our families. Deal?
For the first time in a while, I saw a glimmer thaw his eyes.
Deal.
Fine. I will choose dare.
Then, test your luck.
Felix spun the cylinder and handed the gun to Kelsey. She grabbed it gingerly, her hand shaking as she put it to her head. But then she smiled.
Frack you, Felix. I know it's not low.
My ears rang, and I watched dumbfounded through blood-soaked eyelashes as her body slumped to the ground.
Game over.
Felix mouthed as he pulled the revolver from Kelsey's limp fingers. He released the cylinder and emptied it onto the ground. One empty shell fell alongside the other 4 alive rounds. So, Felix was a lucky bastard after all. My wife and I have been struggling with our relationship ever since our son was born 6 months ago. We haven't had any intimacy since he was born, as she doesn't feel comfortable doing it with our son nearby. I have started throwing myself into my work as a way to distract myself from everything that has been going on. Unfortunately, I have been working from home, so I have not been able to at least leave the house during the day. I keep reminding my wife that I am working, as she keeps coming into my home office to ask me trivial questions. I have snapped at her about this a few times, which always makes me feel guilty afterwards. My boss took notice of all of the hard work I have been doing, and has been dropping hints that I was the main candidate to become the new manager. He gave me a project to finish, and promised that, if I did well with it, then the manager position would be effectively mine. I spent the next few weeks working 14-hour days until it was finally finished. I was so proud of it, and knew that my boss would love it. I contacted my boss, and he told me that he wanted to organize a Zoom meeting tomorrow to show it off to the rest of the company. I got up this morning with an extra spring in my step, as I knew that this was going to go perfectly. I reminded my wife to keep our son quiet during the meeting and not to disturb me at all. She promised she wouldn't come into the room unless I called her. The meeting started well, and I could see that everyone was impressed with my work. I was about 15 minutes into my presentation when my wife started singing away to herself. I could see the bemused look on a few of my coworkers' faces, as they could obviously hear her in the background. I started to get annoyed, as she just kept repeating the same lyrics again and again. It was really obvious that my boss wasn't happy with the singing. A couple of my coworkers were actually miming along with my wife. I knew that my chances of getting this promotion were near to impossible by the end of the meeting, as I had begun to stumble over my words. I stormed out of my office to confront my wife and to demand why she had started singing "Staying Alive" by the Bee Gees. I collapsed to the floor after I walked into the kitchen, as I saw her singing away, while still administering CPR to our son's lifeless body. I lived in an abusive household and just couldn't take it anymore. So this is my suicide letter. When I first started living at Miss T.S., everything seemed fairly normal. Miss T.S. was our landlady, and she kept mostly to herself. She made me run errands and perform chores, sometimes but I didn't mind working a little. The lodging was practically rent-free. There was this other guy, Jerry, that stayed at Miss T's too. I guess you could call him my roommate, though I don't know if mate is the right word. When I first met him, he almost seemed afraid of me. But as I got to know him better, I could say one thing for sure: he was a psychopath. He always tried to get me in trouble with Miss T's. He'd break the crockery, or smash the windows, or turn the house upside down, and somehow, the blame would always be pinned on me. It was almost like Miss T.S. didn't know that he lived in the house too. Try as I might, there was no explaining her the situation. I'd receive a sound broomstick beating from her, while he laughed away. When Miss T.S. would go to one of her brunches, Jerry would make up for her absence. A small disruption to his daily routine, and my lower back would be bashed in with a mallet, or my fingers jammed into the waffle iron. Once, I was playing the piano while he was sleeping. Big mistake. He got up and shut the piano lid so hard that my fingers were flattened to pancakes. Despite all his flaws, there were times when he was more human. Then I almost started caring about him, and I could tell he cared about me too. Sometimes when I was about to pass out from all the pain, he nursed me back to health. There was this one time that I was down with severe cold, and he made me some soup. Usually, he put half a bottle of hot sauce, just to spite me after a row, but I knew he had put a lot of care in this one. I live in an abusive household, but they're about the only family I've got, Miss T.S. and Jerry. As for me, well, no one cares about me. I'm just a silly cat with no more value than as a children's cartoon. I can't bear this anymore. Signing off, Tom. I inherited my grandfather's house after his death. Inside of the house was an attic, and inside of the attic was a collection of paintings. There were watercolors and oils and acrylics, portraits of kings and carpenters, and old women with folded hands, landscapes, vivid forests in bright oil, so real you almost hear the birds. My favorite painting was of a girl by the ocean. Her hair was like sunshine, and her white dress tangled with the wind. She faced away from the artist towards the water. There was only one painting I avoided. It stood in the corner of the room on a white easel covered with a black cloth. I only looked under the covering once. It was a portrait of my grandfather, but more terrible than he'd ever been in life. The thing in the painting resembled my grandfather in the same way a drowned corpse resembles the life that once animated the body. His skin was sallow, teeth cracked, pale black veins twisting across a bare scalp. The artist must have feared my grandfather. I could see no other reason the painter would have left the portrait with such a ravenous expression of hate. One look behind the curtain was enough for me. I left that portrait in its corner. Other than that piece of rot, the collection as a whole was a miracle. I spent so many rainy afternoons and cold mornings in the attic among the pictures that it was immediately obvious to me when the subjects began to move. It was subtle at first. Eyes might shift in a portrait, a tree would rustle against an acrylic breeze. The girl on the beach was turning a degree or two each day. It was a long night in October when I finally saw her face. I'd gone up to the attic with a candle after dinner to check on the progress of the paintings. In my dreams, they came fully to life and joined me, or perhaps even better, allowed me to join them. in their kaleidoscope worlds. The girl on the beach was facing me that night. Her hand was raised slightly, as if in greeting. I sat there all night. I'm not sure when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, my eyes found a massacre. All of the beautiful paintings were torn, as if by animals. The canvas hung in wet tatters, frames were smashed, and everywhere, violence. Only the painting of the girl on the beach was undamaged. But to my horror, it was changed. The girl lay dead on the red-stained sand, her eyes blank and throat ripped open. I heard a brittle creak from the corner of the room. It took me a moment to realize that it was laughter, and it came from behind the black curtain that covered my grandfather's portrait. They never caught the man who killed Danny. In a world with dozens of cameras on every corner, the man who ran over our 10-year-old son as he walked home from school had somehow escaped the scene without being identified. The letter showed up in our mailbox on the 1-year anniversary of Danny's death. It was hand-addressed to my wife and I. No return address.
Hi Mom, hi Dad.
The note began. Those 4 words sent a chill down my spine. Of course, I knew that this letter wasn't really from Danny. I had seen him buried with my own eyes. But to hear Morgan and I referred to as Mom and Dad, it just hit me hard. I hadn't even realized that over the last year, we went from being Mom and Dad back to Morgan and Steve. It was a depressing reversion to pre-children times. So to see the parental terms being applied to us again was emotional. The letter continued.
I know you guys probably miss me, and I don't blame you for that. I get it.
The handwriting was crooked, sloppy. Someone trying to imitate a child's script. What the asshole who wrote this letter didn't know was that Danny had excellent handwriting, even at such a young age.
I just want to let you guys know that it's okay to let go of your grief.
Anger welled up inside of me. This letter could have been from a misguided family friend, trying to make us feel better in some ignorant way. But I knew better than that. I knew who it was from. It was from the man who killed Danny. As it went on, that conclusion became obvious.
Holding onto your grief only brings more pain into the world. You don't want that, do you? That's selfish. And besides, my death wasn't all bad. The man who hit me actually thought it was really fun. Some nights, he lies in bed, remembering how my head popped like a grape under his tires. Other nights, he'll sneak into our backyard, climb the big oak tree, and watch you guys cry through the windows. He brings with him a big old bag of grapes and pops them between his teeth, one after another. Pop, pop. He says the juice running down his chin reminds him of my blood on the pavement. But that's not why I'm writing to you guys. The point of this letter was to thank you, Mom and Dad. Thank you for putting me on this earth, so I could fulfill my sole purpose of providing pleasure to that nice man.
Thank you, and thank you.
I do have one request. Could you make me a little sister for the man to pop? Like he popped me. He says he wants to see if a little girl pops differently than a little boy. Could you make this happen, Mom, Dad? Do it for me, or for the nice man. Love, Danny.
The night was black all around me. The type of darkness where you can't see anything except for the little bit of the shining moon through the windows. I had ended up in this old abandoned house because I ran away from my mom after an argument we had. You see, I recently signed up for a job where I would basically be a lab rat in a laboratory, and lots of weird chemicals will be inserted into my body. The pay would be a few $1,000s a week, which is a lot for someone like me, who's been poor for his whole life. My mom thought this would be highly dangerous and suspicious, as they didn't explain what would happen to me or what chemicals they would put into me. And as you can guess, we got into a big dispute, and I ran away after the argument and ended up here. But now that I stop and pay attention to my surroundings, and I hear some silent footsteps that start to get louder and faster, and I start to run as the sounds come towards me. I run out of the house and down the path that I followed to get here. The sound of footsteps turn into growls and stomps as I continue to run down the path. Soon, I feel like I have been running for hours, even though the route is only 5 minutes long as a walk. I start to think that I will pass out, but for some reason, I don't, and the sounds haven't stopped. In fact, they only keep getting louder and wilder. Ironically, I am not an athletic person at all, so I think this must be pure adrenaline. Then I think about the job offer, and remember that they were going to try to use adrenaline to achieve a kind of super strength serum. Then I stop, and nothing happens, and realize that the sounds aren't coming from near me in the forest, but from somewhere else. I wake up in a lab, and hear scientists talking.
Damn it, he woke up. Restart the simulation. We are on the verge of a breakthrough, and we can't have any mistakes.
Then my eyes start to close, and I hear them say,
We will finally be able to harness the power of adrenaline.
The night was black around me. The kind of darkness where you can't see anything except the little bit of shining moon through the window.
Thank you all for coming. Please enjoy the refreshments provided for you. In case you haven't met me previously, I'm Mark Sloan, the lawyer for your late employer, Mr. Akhenaton. I've worked for him for quite some time, and he expressed the utmost desire to have you all present at the reading of his will. As his household staff, this will be your final duty before you're discharged.
There's a certain detached quality to Mr. Sloane's voice that I don't like. That, and the fact that he's speaking to his red leather briefcase, and not making eye contact with the 20 household staff members seated around Mr. Akhenaton's massive mahogany dining room table. A table laden with all sorts of decadent and colorful treats. It's the very same table at which our employer had entertained guests at the numerous parties and events which routinely took place at the manor. The staff members murmur excitedly as each considers the rewards our employer is about to bestow on us posthumously, along with their own plans for the future. Mr. Akhenaton's death had come as a surprise to us all, as he did not appear to be very old. He was a widower who looked to be maybe in his late 50s, although sometimes one got the impression that he was far older, or possibly even younger. Ageless was really the best way to describe him. He always seemed to be in generally good health, although he had a very pale complexion. Some jokingly whispered that he must be a vampire or something. Still, death must have been on Mr. Akhenaton's mind for some time. He had spent a huge sum of money on the construction of a massive tomb, located in his private cemetery on an acre of his country estate. The thing was so large that it could be readily viewed from the meandering country road fronting his property.
As you surely know,
Mr. Sloane continued,
Mr. Akhenaton had been exceedingly wealthy, but he used up nearly all of his funds on his tomb, of which I'm sure you are all well aware. He wanted to be comfortable and well attended on his journey from this life to the next. And this is where all of you come in.
A loud latching sound startles us, and we look up to see that, unbeknownst to us, the double doors leading into the dining room had been swung quietly closed. Alarmed, others begin to rise from their seats. As it turns out, Mr. Akhenaton was quite old. In fact, he was of pharaonic lineage. As the pharaoh's servants followed him into the afterlife, so would we. This would be our final duty. People start panicking and screaming to let us out, beating their fists futilely on the heavy oaken dining room doors. Then someone suddenly falls over with a loud crashing sound, followed by another. The last thing on my mind is the food, all poisoned, I'm sure of it, as the room swims before my eyes, and all go dark. Mother said the legends told of the beasts just appearing one day out of nowhere. No rhyme or reason. They were just there one day, destroying our families, killing with no remorse. We would rarely even see one stop to examine the casualties. The beasts would plow through, killing with no regard or motivation. Their eyes shone bright in the dark, the most dangerous time for us. Mother said the beasts were why my family had to stay away from the line. Our land was vast, but I could see the expanse beyond the line. But Mother would never allow my brother or I to cross over. It wasn't worth risking a beast appearing. Mother told me of the countless friends and family she'd seen dead along the line at the hands of the beasts. I had only ever seen one friend die. Mother had taken great care to keep us from the line, but we were eating lunch not too far away when it happened. It was broad daylight, and Mother thought it was safe. She was eating, head down, not staring at the line like usual. I saw Mother's friend walk right across the line. Her feet hit the deep blackness of the line, and I watched her feet propel her forward across to the massive land on the other side. I counted her steps, silently praying she would land safely on the other side. Beasts weren't so active in the daytime. I counted 5 steps before a beast appeared, its breath rumbling, and demolished her. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone. The beast didn't even slow. It killed her and kept moving as though it had thousands to kill and no time to waste. I had never seen anything like it. Her body laid along the line, covered in blood. Her insides were bright against the darkness of the line. Mother ushered me away, reiterating the importance of never crossing the line. It was never safe. I asked why any of our community ever crossed the line if it was so dangerous. Sometimes they get a culling, Mother said, and it cannot be ignored. Why have you never gotten one? I asked as we walked home. I have been fortunate enough to not feel the culling across the line. I have only felt it on our side, and I am thankful for that every day, she said, nuzzling my head. I'm not sure how much time passed, but I was much bigger when I woke up one day unable to find Mother. I walked to our usual spots with no trace of her. It wasn't until I got to the line that I knew what happened. She'd gotten the call. Her blood was deep red, pulled around her middle, and seeping onto the grass. I sucked in my breath, and for the first time, put my feet on the line, ready for whatever may come, be it adventure or rumbling, bright-eyed beast.
you subscribe, or the toxic skull will come for you.